Sandra Mitchell stood in front of her bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the badges on her crisp Air Force dress uniform. After 15 years of service, every morning ritual of preparing her uniform felt just as important as her first day at the academy. Her dark fingers smoothed over the silver Colonel insignia, a reminder of how far she'd come from the young girl in Memphis who once dreamed of touching the sky. The early morning sun streamed through her apartment window as she checked her phone. 5:45 a.m. Her flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. would depart in 3 hours. After 6 months of deployment, she was finally heading to the Pentagon for a crucial briefing about her unit's successful operations in Afghanistan. "Don't forget your presentation slides, Sandra," she muttered to herself, double-checking her leather briefcase. Inside were not only the classified documents but also a worn photograph of her team, men and women who had become family during their time overseas. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was quiet, with only a few early morning commuters sharing the road. Sandra's mind wandered to the upcoming briefing. As one of the few African-American female colonels in the Air Force, she knew her presence in the Pentagon would turn heads. But that had never stopped her before. At the airport, Sandra moved efficiently through security, her military ID and credentials earning her respectful nods from TSA agents. She had splurged on a first-class ticket for this flight, a small reward to herself after months of sleeping in military barracks. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," said the young man at the coffee shop as she ordered her usual black coffee with 1 sugar. Sandra smiled warmly, remembering how her father, a Vietnam veteran, used to receive the same acknowledgments. As she waited at her gate, Sandra opened her laptop to review her presentation one last time. The mission she had commanded had been complex, a coordinated rescue operation that saved 32 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. The operation had required precision timing, nerves of steel, and split-second decisions that kept everyone alive. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight AA-237 to Washington, D.C., the gate agent announced over the intercom. Sandra packed up her laptop and joined the line, boarding pass and ID ready. Walking down the jet bridge, she remembered her first flight as a child, a short hop from Memphis to Atlanta to visit her grandmother. That excited little girl would never have imagined she'd one day be commanding air missions or briefing generals at the Pentagon. The flight attendant at the airplane door greeted her with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard, Colonel Mitchell. You're in seat 2A, by the window." Sandra made her way through the first-class cabin, nodding politely to the other passengers who were already seated. Most were businessmen in expensive suits, tapping away on their phones or laptops. A few looked up as she passed, some with subtle surprise crossing their faces. As she approached row 2, Sandra noticed her seatmate had already arrived. James Warren, appearing to be in his mid-60s, wore a tailored charcoal gray suit and was busy organizing papers on his fold-out table. He glanced up briefly as she stopped at their row, his expression shifting from neutral to something less welcoming. Sandra began storing her briefcase in the overhead compartment, maintaining her professional composure despite feeling Warren's eyes following her movements. She'd encountered such looks before, the mixture of surprise, disapproval, and assumption that somehow she didn't belong in first class despite her uniform and rank. "Excuse me," she said politely, gesturing that she needed to access her window seat. Warren didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked pointedly at her ticket, then at her face, then back at her uniform, as if trying to reconcile something in his mind. "I believe you might be mistaken," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several nearby passengers look up from their devices. "This is the first-class cabin." Sandra took a deep breath, drawing on years of experience in handling difficult situations with grace. Little did she know that this flight would become one of her most memorable demonstrations of leadership, dignity, and the power of rising above prejudice. The other passengers had grown quiet, the awkward tension beginning to fill the cabin like a heavy cloud. The stage was set for what would become a powerful lesson in humanity, hidden behind a simple airplane seating arrangement. "I'm well aware this is first class, sir," Sandra replied calmly, holding out her boarding pass. "Seat 2A is my assigned seat." Warren's face tightened as he glanced at her ticket, his jaw clenching visibly. "There must be some mistake," he said loudly, pressing the flight attendant call button. "I paid good money for first class, and I don't believe." He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear to everyone within earshot. A young flight attendant named Jenny quickly appeared, her practiced smile hiding her concern at the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" Jenny asked, looking between Warren and Sandra. "Yes, there certainly is," Warren said, his voice getting louder. "Could you please verify this person's ticket? I find it hard to believe that she's supposed to be in first class." Several passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. Sandra remained standing in the aisle, her posture straight and dignified despite the humiliation Warren was attempting to inflict. Jenny examined Sandra's boarding pass and smiled professionally. "Everything is in order, sir. Colonel Mitchell is correctly assigned to seat 2A. "Colonel?" Warren scoffed, looking at Sandra's uniform with obvious skepticism. "Listen, I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status. I demand to speak to your supervisor." The lead flight attendant, Michael Thompson, a veteran crew member with 20 years of experience, arrived promptly. His expression was serious as he assessed the situation. "Sir," Michael addressed Warren firmly, "Colonel Mitchell's ticket and seating assignment are valid. If you're uncomfortable with your seat assignment, we can try to accommodate you elsewhere in first class, but I must remind you that discriminatory behavior is not tolerated on our flights." Warren's face reddened. "Are you accusing me of discrimination?" "I'm simply concerned about proper protocol and seating arrangements. My son is in the military, so don't try to paint me as—" "Then you should understand the meaning of respect and chain of command," Sandra interjected quietly, her voice carrying authority without raising its volume. "Your son serves alongside people of all backgrounds, I presume?" The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat but remained obstinate. "That's different. I just think there's been a mistake with the seating arrangements." An elderly woman across the aisle spoke up. "The only mistake here is your behavior, sir. I'm embarrassed for you." Other passengers began murmuring in agreement. Warren looked around, seemingly realizing he was losing support rapidly. Michael, the lead attendant, leaned closer to Warren. "Sir, I need your final decision. Would you like to be reseated, or can we proceed with boarding? The flight is nearly full, but we can try to accommodate you in another first-class seat if available." Warren glanced at his expensive watch, then at the growing line of passengers waiting to board. His lips pressed into a thin line as he realized he was causing a scene that wasn't playing out in his favor. "Fine," he muttered, standing up to let Sandra into her window seat. "But I want it noted that I'm not comfortable with this arrangement." As Sandra settled into her seat, she pulled out her laptop and a folder of documents. Among them was the classified report about the rescue mission she commanded, the very mission that had saved 32 American soldiers in Afghanistan. What Warren didn't know was that his own son's unit had been among those rescued that day. The pre-flight announcements began as other passengers continued boarding. Warren sat stiffly in his seat, pointedly avoiding looking in Sandra's direction. She noticed him pull out his laptop and caught a glimpse of his screensaver. A group photo of soldiers in combat gear, one of whom she recognized from the mission files. Sandra took out an airline napkin and began writing, her mind formulating the words that would soon change everything. The note she was about to write would do more than just put Warren in his place. It would force him to confront his prejudices in the most unexpected way. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, the tension between the two passengers remained thick enough to cut with a knife. But Sandra knew that sometimes the best response to ignorance wasn't immediate confrontation, but a carefully planned revelation that could transform hatred into understanding. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Sandra continued working on her laptop, reviewing mission details while occasionally glancing at Warren's screen. The photo of his son's unit remained visible as his screensaver, confirming what she had suspected. The young Lieutenant Warren had indeed been among those her team rescued. Warren shifted uncomfortably in his seat, making a show of moving as far away from Sandra as the first-class seat would allow. Whenever the flight attendants passed by offering drinks or snacks, he made subtle yet pointed comments about maintaining standards in first class. "Would you like something to drink?" Jenny asked, addressing both passengers. "Sparkling water, no ice," Warren said curtly, barely looking up. "Coffee, black, please," Sandra replied with a warm smile. "And thank you for your professionalism earlier." Warren snorted quietly at her comment, then spoke loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Standards these days, they're just not what they used to be. My father flew these routes for 30 years, and things were different then. Sandra took a slow sip of her coffee when it arrived, her mind traveling back to her own father's stories of being one of the first black airmen in his unit. She remembered his words. Excellence is the best response to ignorance. The turbulence hit unexpectedly, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to grip their armrests. Warren's laptop slid forward, and without thinking, Sandra caught it before it could crash to the floor. I didn't ask for your help, Warren snapped, snatching the laptop back. No, you didn't, Sandra replied evenly. Just like those 32 soldiers didn't have to ask for help when they were trapped behind enemy lines. Warren's head turned sharply toward her. What did you say? Operation Swift Response, Sandra continued, her voice low and steady. February 15th last year, your son's unit was pinned down in the Kandahar province. They had been without supplies for 72 hours. The color drained from Warren's face. How do you know about that? Sandra opened her briefcase and pulled out a mission report, carefully angling it so only Warren could see the classified header. I know because I was the Air Command colonel who coordinated the rescue operation. The one who made the call to send in the helicopters despite the sandstorm. The one who refused to abandon those men. Warren stared at the document, his hands trembling slightly. That's classified information. Yes, it is, and I'm heading to the Pentagon to brief the Joint Chiefs about it, Sandra replied, returning the document to her briefcase. Your son, Lieutenant James Warren Jr., was instrumental in keeping his men alive until we could reach them. He showed remarkable leadership under pressure. The businessman's face underwent a series of emotions, disbelief, shock, and then something that looked like shame. He opened and closed his mouth several times, struggling to find words. He never told me who. Warren started, then stopped. In his letters, he just said they were rescued by air support. That's correct, Sandra nodded. And now you know who commanded that air support. The irony of the situation seemed to hit Warren like a physical blow. He looked down at his hands, then out the window, anywhere but at Sandra. Other passengers who had witnessed his earlier behavior were now watching with interest as the proud businessman seemed to shrink in his seat. The elderly woman across the aisle smiled knowingly, having observed the entire interaction. Sandra returned to her work, allowing Warren to process this information in silence. She knew that sometimes the most powerful messages didn't need constant reinforcement, they just needed time to sink in. As the flight continued over the clouds, the tension in their row gradually transformed into something else, a heavy, contemplative silence filled with unspoken realizations. Warren kept glancing at the mission photo on his laptop, then at Sandra, as if seeing her for the first time. The lesson was clear, though no more words had been exchanged. In the quiet cabin of the airplane, at 35,000 feet above the ground, prejudices that had seemed so solid were beginning to crack and crumble, all because of a simple twist of fate that connected two seemingly different worlds. The flight was halfway to Washington, D.C. when Sandra began writing on another airline napkin. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each word carefully chosen. Warren pretended to focus on his laptop, but his eyes kept darting toward her hands as she wrote. More coffee, Colonel? Jenny asked, passing by with a fresh pot. Yes, thank you, Sandra replied, pausing her writing. She noticed Warren's cup was empty too. My seatmate might appreciate a refill as well. Warren looked up, surprised by her consideration after his earlier behavior. Yes, thank you, he mumbled to Jenny. As the flight attendant poured their coffee, Sandra continued writing. The napkin now contained several paragraphs, and she occasionally paused to reference something on her laptop. A bout of turbulence shook the plane, causing Warren to spill a few drops of coffee on his expensive suit. He cursed under his breath, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. Without looking up from her writing, Sandra reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small stain removal pen. She placed it on his tray table without a word. Warren stared at the pen for a long moment before picking it up. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of shame that hadn't been there before. As he worked on the coffee stain, Sandra could see him struggling with something internal. His fingers fidgeted with his wedding ring, and he kept opening and closing his mouth as if wanting to speak, but not finding the right words. Finally, he broke the silence. My son, he never told us how close it was. The rescue mission, I mean. Sandra looked up from her writing. Most soldiers don't share the scariest moments with their families. They want to protect you from that worry. He did mention the sandstorm, though, Warren continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Said they thought no one would be able to reach them because of it. The visibility was near zero, Sandra confirmed, saving her work on the napkin and turning slightly toward him. But we had intel that enemy forces were closing in. Waiting wasn't an option. Warren's hands trembled slightly as he took a sip of coffee. How? How did you manage it? We used advanced GPS guidance systems and thermal imaging, Sandra explained, her voice professional but gentle. But mostly, it came down to the skill and courage of every person involved, the pilots, the ground teams, and your son's unit maintaining their position despite impossible odds. A flight attendant passed by with lunch service, placing their pre-ordered meals in front of them. Warren barely glanced at his food, too engrossed in the conversation. Junior told me the rescue team knew exactly where to find them, he said. That it was like they had eyes everywhere, even in that storm. Sandra nodded, opening her meal tray. We'd been tracking their position for days, waiting for the right moment. When their supplies ran critically low and we got word of enemy movement, I made the call. Some thought it was too risky, but you did it anyway, Warren finished, his voice thick with emotion. You saved my boy. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had been pretending not to listen, wiped a tear from her eye. Other nearby passengers had also grown quiet, drawn into the powerful moment unfolding between the two people who had started the flight as adversaries. Sandra returned to her writing, adding a few final lines to the napkin. The message she was crafting wasn't just about the rescue mission anymore. It had become something more profound, a bridge between two worlds that Warren had never thought could connect. As she wrote, Warren pulled out his phone and opened his photos. He scrolled until he found what he was looking for, a recent picture of his son in uniform, standing proud at his latest promotion ceremony. Would you like to see a recent photo of him? Warren asked hesitantly, offering his phone to Sandra. The gesture, simple as it was, represented a massive shift in the man who had been so dismissive just hours before. Sandra accepted the phone with a smile, recognizing that sometimes the greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when hearts and minds began to change. Tive. Sandra studied the photo of Lieutenant Warren Jr. carefully. The young man stood tall in his dress uniform, his proud smile reminding her of countless other soldiers she'd commanded over the years. He has your eyes, she observed, handing the phone back to Warren, and the same determined look. Warren swallowed hard, looking at the photo of his son. He wanted to join the military since he was a boy. I tried to talk him into taking over my business instead, but, he paused, shaking his head. Now I understand why he chose this path. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing they'd be experiencing rough air for the next 20 minutes. As the plane shook, Sandra continued writing on her napkin, her hand steady despite the bumps. Warren watched her writing for a few moments before speaking again. Colonel Mitchell, I don't know how to. You don't need to, Sandra interrupted gently, not looking up from her writing. This isn't about apologies. It's about understanding. A flight attendant passed through the cabin, checking that all seat belts were fastened. The elderly woman across the aisle took the opportunity to speak up. You know, she said, addressing both Sandra and Warren, my late husband was a colonel too. He used to say that the military teaches you to see beyond color, beyond prejudice, because when you're fighting for your life, the only thing that matters is the person next to you. Warren's face flushed with shame again. He pulled out his laptop, and the screensaver photo of his son's unit appeared once more. This time he really looked at it, at all the different faces, all the different backgrounds, united in one purpose. In that photo, Sandra said, nodding toward his screen, I can identify every soldier. Not just their names, but their stories. Private Rodriguez, who carried the radio equipment through the sandstorm. Sergeant Chen, who kept everyone's spirits up with jokes even when they were running out of water. Corporal Washington, who shared his last protein bar with your son. Warren stared at the faces she mentioned, seeing them with new eyes. They never gave up hope, he said quietly. No, they didn't, Sandra agreed, folding the napkin she'd been writing on. Just like I hope we never give up hope that people can change, that understanding can replace fear, that bridges can be built where walls once stood. The turbulence began to ease, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Several passengers got up to stretch their legs, but Sandra and Warren remained seated, the weight of their conversation holding them in place. Warren pulled out his wallet and removed a small worn photo. "This is Junior when he first enlisted," he said, offering it to Sandra. "Before his first deployment. Before everything." Sandra accepted the photo carefully. The image showed a younger, more innocent version of Lieutenant Warren, his new uniform still crisp and unmarked by the harsh realities of war. "He looks so young," she commented, running her finger along the edge of the photo. "He was," Warren replied, his voice cracking slightly. "He still is. And if it wasn't for you—" Sandra held up her hand, stopping him. "Every person on that rescue mission was doing their duty. Your son did his duty too, leading his men through those 3 days of hell." As she handed the photo back, their eyes met properly for the first time since the flight began. Gone was the hostility, the prejudice, the assumption of superiority. In its place was something new: respect, gratitude, and the dawning recognition of shared humanity. The napkin sat folded on Sandra's tray table, waiting to be delivered. But now it would carry a different message than she had originally planned. Not just a revelation about the rescue mission, but a deeper truth about the battles we fight not on foreign soil, but in our own hearts and minds. The plane continued its journey toward Washington, D.C., carrying two people who had started as strangers divided by prejudice, but were slowly becoming something else entirely, witnesses to the power of understanding and the possibility of change. As the flight entered its final hour, Sandra finished writing her note. The airline napkin now contained not just the details of the rescue mission, but something more meaningful, a message about humanity, understanding, and the bridges that connect us all. Warren had grown quiet, lost in thought as he scrolled through more photos on his phone. Each swipe revealed another image of his son with his fellow soldiers, training together, eating together, protecting each other in a foreign land far from home. "Colonel Mitchell," Warren said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did Junior, was he scared during those 3 days?" Sandra put down her pen and turned to face him. "Your son was a leader, Mr. Warren. He kept his fear hidden to protect his men's morale. But in his mission report, he wrote something I'll never forget." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out another document, pointing to a highlighted section. He wrote, "Fear wasn't an option. My men needed me to be strong, so I borrowed strength from thinking about my father, who taught me never to give up." Tears welled up in Warren's eyes as he read his son's words. His hands trembled as he touched the paper, tracing his son's signature at the bottom. I had no idea," he managed to say. "All this time, I've been so proud of his military service, yet I've been disrespecting everything it stands for." He gestured vaguely at their earlier confrontation. Sandra folded the note she had written and placed it carefully on Warren's tray table. "Read it when you're ready," she said quietly. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had been pretending to read her book, wiped her eyes with a tissue. Other passengers who had witnessed the entire journey from hostility to understanding exchanged knowing looks. Warren picked up the napkin but didn't unfold it yet. Instead, he turned to Sandra with pain in his eyes. "My father, he was like me. He passed down his prejudices along with his business. I never questioned them until today." "It's never too late to choose a different path," Sandra replied, thinking of her own father's struggles in the military decades ago. A flight attendant approached their row. "We'll be beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. in about 20 minutes, she announced. "Can I get either of you anything before we land?" Both declined, and as the attendant moved on, Warren finally unfolded the napkin. His hand shook as he began to read Sandra's carefully written words. The note detailed not just the rescue mission, but the stories of every soldier involved, their backgrounds, their families, their dreams. It spoke of Lieutenant Warren's leadership, his courage, and how he embodied the true spirit of military service by uniting people from all walks of life toward a common purpose. At the bottom, Sandra had written, "Your son doesn't see color, creed, or background when he leads his men. He sees fellow Americans, fellow humans, worthy of respect and dignity. Perhaps that's his greatest lesson to us all." Warren read the words twice, then 3 times. Tears fell freely now, spotting the napkin. He made no attempt to hide them. "I've been so blind," he whispered, carefully folding the napkin and placing it in his suit pocket, right over his heart. "All these years?" Sandra reached over and patted his hand gently. "Sometimes it takes a moment of clarity to see what's been in front of us all along." The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final approach into Washington, D.C. As the plane began its descent, the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the cabin. Warren straightened his tie and took a deep breath. "Colonel Mitchell, would you allow me to buy you a coffee at the airport? I'd like to hear more about the mission, about Junior's service, about everything." Sandra smiled, seeing the genuine change in the man who had started the flight as an angry stranger. "I think I'd like that, Mr. Warren. I think I'd like that very much." As the plane descended through the clouds, both passengers sat in comfortable silence, each understanding that sometimes the most important journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the distance a heart can travel from darkness to light. The plane touched down at Reagan National Airport, its wheels squealing against the runway. As other passengers rushed to gather their belongings, Sandra and Warren remained seated, both lost in thought about their transformative journey. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C., the captain announced over the intercom. Local time is 11:45 a.m., and the temperature is 72 degrees. As they waited for first-class passengers to deplane, Warren pulled out his phone and opened his messages. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing. "I'm sending a message to Junior," he explained to Sandra. I want him to know I met you." Sandra watched as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he showed her the message. "Son, today I met Colonel Mitchell, the officer who commanded your rescue mission. She taught me more about honor, dignity, and respect in one flight than I've learned in my entire life. I've never been more proud to be your father." Before he could hit send, his phone chimed with an incoming message from his son. "Dad, just got word that Colonel Mitchell is briefing the Joint Chiefs today about our rescue. She's an incredible leader. Hope you get to meet her someday." Warren's hands trembled as he read the message to Sandra. The timing seemed almost magical, a perfect closing to their unexpected encounter. As they stood to retrieve their belongings, the elderly woman across the aisle approached them. "I hope you don't mind my saying this," she said, "but I've been flying these routes for 30 years, and I've never witnessed anything quite like what happened here today." Other passengers nodded in agreement as they passed by, some offering small smiles or respectful nods to Sandra. The transformation they had witnessed was something none of them would soon forget. In the terminal, Warren insisted on carrying Sandra's briefcase despite her polite protests. They made their way to the airport's coffee shop, where the morning rush had dwindled to a few scattered customers. "2 coffees, please," Warren told the barista. "1 black, 1 sparkling water." Sandra interrupted with a gentle smile. "I've had enough coffee for one day." They found a quiet table near the window, where planes took off and landed against the backdrop of the Washington Monument in the distance. Warren pulled out the napkin again, smoothing its creases carefully. "I'm going to frame this," he said quietly. "Put it in my office next to Junior's service photo. A reminder of what really matters." Sandra checked her watch. She still had an hour before her Pentagon briefing. "Mr. Warren, there's something else you should know about your son's unit." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a different document. "Next month, they're receiving a unit commendation for their actions during those 3 days. Lieutenant Warren is being specifically cited for his leadership." Warren's eyes filled with tears again. "He didn't tell me." "The official announcement hasn't been made yet," Sandra explained. "But as the commanding officer who recommended the commendation, I thought you should know." Before Warren could respond, his phone chimed again. Another message from his son. "Dad, my CO just told me about the commendation. I was going to surprise you. Guess Colonel Mitchell beat me to it." Warren laughed through his tears, showing Sandra the message. He always was terrible at keeping secrets. The airport buzzed with activity around them, but at their small table, time seemed to stand still. 2 people who had started the day as strangers divided by prejudice now sat together as friends united by understanding. Sandra began gathering her things, preparing to head to the Pentagon. Warren stood as she did, extending his hand. "Colonel Mitchell, I..." "Sandra," she corrected gently. I think we're past formalities now. Warren nodded, grasping her hand firmly. Sandra, thank you. Not just for saving my son, but for saving something in me too. As she turned to leave, Warren called after her one last time. The Pentagon briefing. Will you tell them about what happened on the flight today? Sandra smiled. No, Mr. Warren. Some lessons are meant to be carried in our hearts, not written in reports. She walked away toward the security checkpoint, her uniform drawing respectful glances from passersby. Behind her, Warren watched her go, the napkin still clutched in his hand. A simple piece of paper that had changed everything. 2 months later, Sandra stood at attention in the Pentagon's main ceremony hall, watching as medals and commendations were pinned on the chests of the soldiers from Operation Swift Response. Lieutenant James Warren Jr. stood tall among them, his face beaming with pride. In the audience, she spotted James Warren Sr., sitting straight-backed in his chair, the same napkin from the flight carefully preserved in a small frame on his lap. But he wasn't alone. Next to him sat the elderly woman from the plane, who had become an unexpected friend to both Warren and Sandra after their shared experience. As the ceremony concluded, Lieutenant Warren made his way through the crowd to his father. Sandra watched their embrace from a distance, noting how different Warren Sr. looked now, humbler, gentler, his face radiating genuine joy as he spoke with soldiers of every background who came to greet him. Colonel Mitchell, Lieutenant Warren called out, waving her over. Please join us. Sandra approached the small group, and Warren Sr. immediately stood at attention, a gesture of respect that would have seemed impossible just 2 months ago. The napkin changed everything, Warren Sr. said quietly to Sandra, gesturing to the frame. I keep it on my desk at work. Every new employee sees it. Here's the story. It's become something of a company tradition now. Lieutenant Warren looked confused. What napkin? Dad's been talking about it for weeks, but won't tell me the whole story. Sandra and Warren Sr. exchanged knowing looks. Some stories are better saved for family dinners. Sandra replied with a smile. The elderly woman from the flight, Mrs. Thompson, chimed in. I've been flying for decades, dear, and I've seen many things. But watching your father's heart change at 35,000 feet, that was something special. Later, at the reception, Warren Sr. approached Sandra with a small package. I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this, he said, handling it to her carefully. Inside was a beautifully crafted silver picture frame. It held 2 photos side by side, one of Lieutenant Warren's unit from the rescue mission, and another taken just minutes ago at the ceremony. Below the photos was a small brass plate engraved with the words, Sometimes the greatest battles we win are against ourselves. It's beautiful, Sandra whispered, touching the frame gently. There's something else, Warren Sr. said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. I created a scholarship fund at my company, the James Warren Sr. Diversity and Leadership Program. Every year, we'll sponsor 5 minority students through college and guarantee them positions in our executive training program. Sandra looked at him in surprise. If my son can trust his life to people of all backgrounds, Warren continued, then I can trust my company's future to them too. Lieutenant Warren joined them, proudly wearing his new commendation. Dad's changed, Colonel. Whatever happened on that flight? Thank you. The elderly Mrs. Thompson appeared with glasses of champagne for everyone. To new beginnings, she toasted, her eyes twinkling. As they celebrated, Sandra thought about how a single flight had sparked a chain reaction of change. Warren's company was transforming, his employees were learning a powerful lesson about prejudice and redemption, and somewhere, other hearts were opening to new possibilities. You know, Warren Sr. said thoughtfully, I kept my airline ticket from that day too. Framed it right next to the napkin. Seat 2B, the best seat I've ever had, though I didn't know it at the time. Lieutenant Warren laughed. Dad, you're getting sentimental in your old age. Maybe I am, his father replied, but sometimes it takes a lifetime to learn what really matters. And sometimes it takes a 3-hour flight and a colonel with infinite patience to teach an old man new tricks. As the reception wound down, Sandra prepared to leave. Warren Sr. stopped her one last time. The napkin, your words that day, they didn't just change me, he said, they're changing others too. Every person who reads it in my office, every student in our new program, every life they touch afterward. It's like ripples in a pond, spreading further than we can see. Sandra smiled, thinking of all the battles she'd fought in her military career. Sometimes, she replied, the most important victories aren't won with weapons or strategies, but with understanding and an open heart. As she walked away, she heard Warren Sr. begin telling his son the story of that fateful flight, starting with the words, "Son, let me tell you about the day I learned what true courage really means." The story of C2A and 2B would be told many times over the years, a reminder that even at 35,000 feet, it's never too late for the human heart to rise higher.